In November, they brought over the whole collection to Britain for the first time and gave a concert. I went and with such a wealth of Partch followers and experts on hand, took the opportunity to put together an overview of the life and work of Harry Partch. And first of all, Bob Gilmore, who's written the definitive Harry Partch Biography.
His whole life is so fascinating and endlessly mysterious in many ways, and I found when I started to research his life that there are periods in his life where he's extremely busy, full of exciting creative ideas. Music is coming out of him non-stop. Then there are these other long stretches where he's apparently doing nothing and life is terribly hard. He's burdened down by all of these uncertainties, financial uncertainties, professional uncertainties. And the whole pattern of his life that comes across from all of that when you put those two things together is like no other creative artist that I know. Extraordinary mixture of enormous achievement and great underachievement. So I just got drawn into this extraordinary personality behind all this music. And even though my original intention was simply to write a short book about the music itself, I quickly found that in his case, his music is so inseparable from this extraordinary life he had that to understand music without knowing a bit about him as a man seemed virtually impossible.
The creative person shows himself naked, and the more vigorous his creative act, the more naked he appears, sometimes totally vulnerable, yet always invulnerable in the sense of his own integrity.
You said that his life was inseparable from the pieces that he wrote. Can you give us some examples of that?
I suppose the most obvious examples are those works that spring from the years during the Depression in America in the 1930s and 1940s, when he lived pretty much as a hobo on and off for 8 years. And like many homeless men during that time, he was forced to travel around the country looking for work. And it was a terrible time in his life. I have the impression, from what little we were able to piece together about those years, that he literally almost froze to death or starved to death on a number of occasions. And in some ways, it left, I think, quite a deep scar in him that he never quite got over. So we have pieces like U.S. Highball, which recounts his journey across the country from San Francisco to Chicago in search of support for his work and all the things that happened to him on the way. We have a journal called Bitter Music, which is to be read and with musical illustration is to be played at the piano if you're sufficiently virtuosic to do that. And what's amazing about these pieces is that he never romanticizes that existence. It's not like a sort of Kerouac figure who writes about his experiences on the road in rather glamorous, seductive terms. Partch's vision, first of all, it's 10 years earlier than that, and it's also much bleaker in a way. But still, there's this wonderful radiant spirit of optimism in these works, that the human spirit can rise above even those sorts of circumstances.
Leaving San Francisco, California,
I got a letter that I said, may God's richest blessings be upon you. Da 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 da, blessings be upon you.
Harry Partch is known now as an inventor of musical instruments. During those years that you're talking about, what sort of musical instruments did he invent?
Well, his musical instruments took shape gradually over a number of years between 1930 and shortly before his death in 1974. During those years when he was living as a hobo, the instruments were most of the time in storage in various places, and they basically were only four by that point. An adapted viola, which is like a conventional viola with an elongated neck, a reed organ called the chromelodeon, which he retuned and painted in various colours according to a system that he'd worked out, a kithara, which is a large instrument a bit like a harp, inspired by drawings he'd seen on ancient Greek vases and things of that sort, and an adapted guitar. Most of the hobo pieces, so-called, were written for himself to perform vocally and to accompany himself on the adapted guitar, a bit like a folk musician. And at that time, his musical heroes included people like Woody Guthrie, whose music he felt expressed an authentic American perspective.
Standing down in Portland town one day, I was standing down in Portland town one day. I was standing down in a Portland town one day.
As his artistic vision changed over the years, he came to place more and more importance on how the instruments looked on stage. And at some point during the 1940s, I think, he began to acquire a sense of these instruments as being not just functioning musical instruments, but also beautiful works of sculpture. And he devoted a great deal of activity to building instruments, crafting them in beautiful forms, sometimes using unusual materials and unusual shapes. And he spent a lot of time thinking about how the performing musician ought to look on stage playing these instruments. Some of them are physically very large, so the actual movements of your hands and arms that you have to make to play them have to be very graceful. And he spent a long time talking to his musicians about this idea, about how to interact with the instrument physically. He wanted musicians to be almost like dancers or actors, or as he put it, integral parts of the whole theatrical experience. And I feel he never quite managed to realize that vision 100%. It always somehow was just beyond his grasp. But he worked all his, especially his later life, from 1950s, 1960s until the time of his death, in pursuit of this almost impossible vision.
My music is visual. It is corporeal, oral, and visual. And I might suggest that photos of the instruments be consulted while listening to them, even though the corporeal action of playing will be absent.
There's always the danger there that he was well aware of, that people would simply become disciples or devotees or followers. And he said on one famous occasion that if anybody ever calls themselves a follower of his, he would strangle them.
Responsible freedom, it seems to me, is the desideratum. The widely revered master-disciple concept represents, on both sides, too easy an escape into the limbo of no responsibility. I have said that if anyone calls himself a pupil of mine, I will happily strangle him. But this is simply the expression of an attitude, and amazingly, in the deeper meaning, it is an expression of hope.
So what he really wanted was people to look at his work, to take the inspiration from it, and then do whatever they wanted. And I think it would have pleased him that some of the artists that I think have taken up aspects of his work have been, as you said earlier, in very diverse domains.
How do you think Partch will be seen in the next century?
I think his example will remain as an inspiration to anybody wanting to, as he put it, go outside in music. So that whatever the prevailing fashions or the prevailing orthodoxies are of the day, he's always something else. So I think that just that whole wish to be outside of whatever is current, he's the most illuminating example, I think, of somebody who is prepared to do that to a great extent, and that example, I feel, remains.
This thing began with truth, and truth does exist.
That was part of Harry Partch's study on Olympos pentatonic, number 1 from 11 Intrusions, which he recorded in 1949. There are 4 new CDs of original Partch recordings which have recently been released on the CRI label, and more information on those and on all the people Mark spoke to in that feature are available if you apply for our increasingly essential Mixing It playlist. This has never been more widely or easily accessed, and here's how. You can email us at mixing.it@bbc.co.uk. You can hunt us down on the internet, www.bbc.co.uk/radio3. You can look us up on page 652 of CFAX, or you can sharpen your quill, iron the parchment, and write to us at Mixing It, BBC Radio 3, Broadcasting House, London, W1A 1AA.
Well, flicking through the current edition of Time Out, the London Listings magazine, I noticed they gave our Harry Partch feature a favourable mention, but said by the end of it they longed for a good old chorus or a doo-wop. Well, how about a stonking slab of African salsa instead, from Super Kayor de Dakar? This is from a compilation called African Salsa on the Earthworks label, which features 14 tracks by 5 different artists. I particularly like the blend of stinging high-life guitar and Latin rhythms on this track, Zamza Bop. We're back next week with an all-CD show. Until then, good night.